Get social with us. Follow us on Instagram at Goodtaste TV. Hey everyone, welcome to Good Taste for the Soul and happy holidays and Merry Christmas. It's such a special time of year. I wanted a very special guest on the show today. For Christians, this is a huge, huge celebration, but for some, not so much. The guest we're having today is a New York Times bestselling author that I've been trying to get on the show for nearly a year now. And he finally said yes. So I'm so excited. He wrote a book called The Case for Christ. This book was written some 30 years ago. Has withstood the test of time, has sold millions of copies. He's an incredible author. He was an investigative journalist in Chicago and an atheist, and he set out to prove that the case for Christ was false. There was no resurrection from the dead. His book is fascinating, and his story is too. Here's Lee Strobel. I am really thrilled to get to talk to you. I don't know if you remember, I reached out to you about The Case for Christ after I read it. And that was before the podcast was even an idea.
Oh, wow. Oh,
yeah. So this is really kind of
awesome.
full circle. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Very cool.
Yeah, I'm great. I'm really grateful
Well,
that
thanks.
this all worked out. Well, let's just dive right in
Yeah,
because
sure.
you have a new book out and we'll talk
Yes.
about that.
Yes.
To me, this is a
That's
great.
actually the old version you've got there, but
Oh, is it
that's
really?
all right. It's got the same title.
Amazon.
Yeah. Did they send you that one?
Yeah.
Oh, well.
Yeah. Well, I may have, how you click, I may have ordered the wrong one, but it's
Well,
wonderful in any event. It really is. And here are my Lee Strobel books. The other one I had, I've lent out, but I've become a big fan. I had never read your book. I had heard about it over the years, and it was kind of like, well, I'm a Christian. That's great that he has a book that he, talks about the proof for Christ, but I don't need to read that. Lee, I'm telling you, it was one of my favorite reads. I started reading it and I would sit there for hours, just mesmerized, go back and reread the chapter. And so I'm excited to dive in.
Oh, that's so cool. That's very encouraging. Thank you.
It's true. And as many readers, millions literally, as you've had over the years, I know, new people come into the sphere of reality all the time.
Yes.
And so there may be some who don't know about this book. And it's a book I think is well worth everybody knowing about. So let's just dive right in. The premise that you set up for writing this book, I absolutely love. I used to be a courthouse reporter too, by the way.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, investigative work. And so tell everyone about your former life, because you were at a very high level of journalism.
Yeah, I was legal editor of the Chicago Tribune. My degrees are in journalism and law. And I was an atheist for much of my life. I just thought the mere concept of an all-loving, all-powerful creator of the universe was crazy. Wasn't worth my time to check out or even investigate. Married a woman who was agnostic. She really was kind of in spiritual neutral. Got married young. I was 20. She was 19.
Wow.
And then several years later, we moved into a condo in Chicago, and the woman downstairs came up with a plate of cookies to say hi. And she ended up becoming best friends with my wife, Leslie. And she was a Christian, a nurse. And they would have long discussions about spiritual matters. They went to church together. And then one day, my wife gave me the worst news any atheist husband could get. She said, I've decided to become a Christian. And I thought, oh, no. My first thought was divorce. I mean,
really?
I was going to walk out. But then I thought maybe I could rescue her from this cult that she got involved in. And even as an atheist, I recognize it wouldn't be that hard. All I'd have to do is disprove the resurrection of Jesus.
Well, and to give people some insight, your work as you were an editor at one point. Was it Chicago Tribune or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Your job was investigations,
Yes.
covering murder trials and things of that nature. And that was back in the day before we had a computer, really, and AI.
Yes. It was back in the days when newspapers mattered.
Yeah, exactly. That is so true. And when there were real editors and real journalists.
Yeah.
No offense to my friends out there that are still in that world.
I know. God bless them.
Yeah. I hear you on that. But it was a different time. And so you were and you were very good at it, apparently.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, I won
Very
awards for
successful.
investigative. I broke a lot of the stories of the Ford Pinto controversy. You're too young
Yes,
to
you wrote a
remember
book
that,
about
maybe,
that.
but yeah, yeah, I wrote a book about that, and so yeah, I did a lot of investigative stuff and covered Supreme Court cases, things like that, and legal profession and stuff, and I really enjoyed it. Love being on the having a front row seat to history. It was
Yeah,
exciting. It was back then, we had 4 daily newspapers in Chicago, uh, 2 all news radio stations, 4 or 5, I guess it was, local television stations. So, it was a hotbed of journalism back
yeah.
then.
And people wanted good journalism, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
The truth mattered, yeah. I started I feel like like I say, I'm not very far behind you in age, but sometimes I hear myself say these things and I think, "Man, I kinda sound like my parents did when I
I
was."
know, but I worry
But
about our country. I worry
I
about
know,
the state of journalism. Not that there
I
aren't
do
good
too.
people in it anymore, but the money isn't there for newspapers to do. We had 1,000
Right.
people in the newsroom back when I was there. That's a lot of people. That's a big
Yeah,
payroll. Now, Tribune Tower, which was famous, is condos, and
yeah.
they don't even have a newsroom anymore. It's all remote. It
It's
just isn't the same. It's kind of sad.
no, it's not the same either. It's so corporate driven and,
Yeah.
with the budget's gone, the lawyers are gone to look over
Yeah.
investigative scripts and whatnot, and so, yeah,
Yeah.
it's a different time, but let's go back to your time. So you were this
Yeah.
hard-nosed investigative reporter, very good at what you do. I would imagine you had a pretty good ego.
Yeah.
Success will do that, and you said your lifestyle was not anything that, I
Yeah.
guess a Christian or someone would look at and think, "Oh, what a great guy."
Well, I kinda did the math in my mind. I thought, if there is no God, if there is no heaven, if there is no hell, if there is no judgment, if there is no ultimate accountability, then the most
Yeah,
logical way to live life would be as a hedonist, someone who just pursued pleasure. And that's what I did. So I lived a very immoral and drunken and profane and narcissistic, self-absorbed, self-destructive in some ways. That was my life. What people
yeah,
saw was me winning awards for investigative reporting. They didn't see the other side when I was literally drunk in the snow in an alley on Saturday night. So
yeah,
I lived a very ugly, looking back, a very ugly life. It was so bad that my little daughter, Allison, when she was a toddler, if she was alone in the living room playing with some toys and she heard me come home from work through the front door, her natural reaction was just to gather her toys and go in her room and shut the door. Is she going to be
mm,
drunk again? She can be yelling and
oh, man.
screaming and literally kicking holes in the wall out of frustration, which I did. It's nice and quiet in here. And that was a reality of our life.
Well, when your wife becomes a Christian,
Yeah.
I would imagine she was a little nervous about telling you that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. We actually wrote a book about it called Spiritual Mismatch. What do
Oh,
you do if
really?
your spouse is not a Christian and you are? And
Yeah.
it was a tumultuous time in our marriage. Oh, my goodness. Because all of a sudden our values diverged. She wanted to
Mhm.
give money to the church. She wanted to go to church on Sunday. She wanted to raise our children in the faith. And I'm digging in my heels and saying, I'm afraid she's going to turn into some holy roller who's going to look down her nose at me and turn the kids against me. And poor dad, he's not a Christian. And it was just a very tumultuous time in our marriage.
So what did you decide to do? Because like you said, you were thinking divorce.
Yeah. I decided to disprove Christianity. And even as an atheist, I recognized that would not be that hard. All I would have to do is disprove the resurrection of Jesus. Because clearly that's the linchpin of the Christian
Yeah.
faith. Jesus clearly claimed to be God. At one point, he got up before a group and he says, I and the Father are one. And the Greek word for one there is not masculine, it's neuter, which means he was not saying I and the Father are the same person. He was saying I and the Father are the same thing. We're one in nature, we're one in essence. And the audience understood what he was doing. They picked up stones to kill him. They said, you're just a man and you're claiming to be God. So Jesus claimed to be God, but so what? I could claim to be God. Anybody could claim to be God. But if
Right.
Jesus claimed to be God, died, and then 3 days later returned from the dead, that's pretty good evidence he's telling
That's
the
pretty
truth.
good evidence, but you
Yeah,
didn't have
yeah.
that evidence when you started out,
That's
at
true.
least not the kind of evidence you were looking for. So literally
That's
you
true.
approached, um, the case for Christ and the resurrection like you would a murder mystery or
Yes.
a murder trial,
Yes.
in the courtrooms there in Chicago.
Yeah, I mean, and back then, this is, as you said, before the internet, so young people won't understand this, but we literally had to go to museums and libraries and use microfiche and microfilm, which they probably don't know what it is, to do research. I remember there was one book written in the 1800s about the resurrection that I really wanted to get a hold of. So back then, what do? You go to a library, you fill out an interlibrary loan, and then they
Yeah,
would do a search. And so 3 months later, I get a call. "We found your book, and we got it here for you." It had rubber bands around it and everything. And I mean, that was just the way you had to do research back then. Today, it's a lot easier than it was back in the day.
yeah. But no, you hit the streets too. So
Yeah.
it's interesting because you set up the premise of I love the way you use the analogies to different court cases that you covered
Yeah, yeah,
because you set up the premise for what you're about to talk about. And you literally went to experts all over the country um, for
Well,
certain things you were looking at, I
yeah,
guess
in my
we can.
original investigation, it was mostly by phone, and I would call up scholars and experts. And the funny thing is, I would mislead them. I would say, "Hey, I'm Lee Strobel from the Chicago Tribune. I have some questions," and they think I'm working on an
Ah,
article or something, and I wasn't. When it came, I didn't intend to write a book about this. I was just trying to satisfy my own
okay.
curiosity. So then later, years later, after I came to faith, my wife said to me one day, "Why don't you write a book about this?" And I thought, oh man, to do that, I'd have to make sure I've got everything down exactly right. I got to tape record these interviews. I got to. So then
Yeah,
I kind of went back, and as I say in the book, I retraced and amplified my original investigation to go on the road and actually sit down. Some of these interviews I did with scholars would take 2 days, and shrink that down to one chapter in a book. So it's been a great adventure, and that's how virtually all my books have been. I'm not the world's leading expert on a lot of this stuff. I just find them and I
well,
ask
that's
them
what
the tough
makes
questions. Yeah.
yeah, and I think that's what makes the book so powerful and the
Yeah.
point it's proving, um, because you really do set out some unbelievable evidence that unless you've dug
Yeah.
in as a scholar and looked at this stuff, you wouldn't know,
Yeah.
because
Yeah. I sure
Christianity is
didn't know it.
yeah, no, I didn't either. I
Yeah.
wanna talk about some of it because it is
Yeah.
absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
Um, One of the questions that comes up for skeptics that I've seen, and I know you address it as well, a lot of folks are skeptical of the authenticity of the Gospels. And those are
Yeah.
really kind of the Jesus biographies, right?
Right. Right. They're classified as ancient biographies by historians.
Yeah. And there's some folks have pointed out maybe discrepancies. Is it Mark that starts in the middle of his life? They
Yeah,
don't
right.
all.
They don't all report the same thing, and which is
Yeah.
natural. If somebody else has already covered something, you may not want to recover that particular topic. You may want to focus on something else. I don't see conflicts between the gospels. I do see differences, and
Mhm.
as you know, in a court of law, if you have four witnesses who come in and say the exact same thing, the objection is raised collusion. Nobody says the
That's
exact same
true.
thing because people will see if you see a traffic accident, four people see a traffic accident, they're all going to describe it from a different perspective. And so, because you have different perspectives and different purposes in writing, often you'll get differences in the way these things are presented. And that's true of the four gospels. I think they pass the tests of authenticity. And the reason I say that is they are rooted in eyewitness accounts. We have two of them written by disciples themselves, by John and Matthew. We have Mark, who was the scribe of Peter. Peter was an eyewitness, a disciple, one of the inner circle of Jesus. And my favorite gospel was written by Luke because he was sort of a first century investigative reporter.
Yeah.
Um, he wasn't an eyewitness himself, but he said, I quote, carefully investigated everything from the beginning so I could get an orderly account of the certainty of what took place. And so he investigates things as a reporter would. And I believe, talking about Christmas in my book Case for Christmas, he goes into depth on the story about the birth of Jesus. And my theory is if you look at the number of times that Mary is mentioned in Luke, I think Luke wrote his gospel account of the birth of Jesus from the perspective of Mary. He may have
Oh,
interviewed Mary. He mentions Joanna and Susanna, who were people who he interviewed and knew personally. They knew Mary. So I believe he either interviewed Mary or people who knew Mary personally. And then the other detailed account is in Matthew. Well, his comes from the perspective of Joseph, because Matthew later became a leader in the church of Jerusalem. And one of the other leaders of the church of Jerusalem was James, the half brother of Jesus. So James apparently shared with him the story that he would have gotten from his father Joseph. So it makes sense that there's two accounts of the birth of Jesus in the two gospels. Um, they they don't conflict. They fit together very well.
yeah.
And then
They
Mark, who doesn't, as you said, he kind of comes a little later. He starts his gospel a little later. He doesn't talk about the birth of Jesus because, others are kind of taking care of that. But in Mark 6, verse 3, he refers to Jesus as Mary's son. You would not do that in first century Jewish culture. You would always refer to someone as the father's son, as Joseph's son. Even if Joseph were deceased by then,
Oh,
you would always refer to Jesus as Joseph's son. He didn't. He referred to him as Mary's son, which to me
yeah.
is a nod to the fact that this was an unusual birth. And then John doesn't have an account of the birth of Jesus, but he has this magnificent he was the last gospel he written. He has this magnificent theological opening to his gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then the Word entered into our world and dwelt among us. And so he refers to the incarnation, the birth of Jesus, in these very theological terms. So I see these things fitting together, not being
Yeah.
contradictory.
Well, and one of the terms I think you used in the case for Christ was the importance of, is it generational knowledge? Um,
Yes. Yes.
Compare and contrast that to some of the other religions, because I think a lot of people, it's a common thought that
Yeah.
even the Gospels were written, like so many books and
Right.
biographies from centuries past, were written hundreds of years after the
Yeah.
events, and that's not the
That's the
case here.
rap that you hear, but it's just not true.
Yeah.
A couple of things about that. First of all, the gospel were written a lot earlier than people think. For instance, you can look at Luke. We mentioned Luke earlier. Luke
Mhm.
wrote a quarter of the entire New Testament. He wrote the book of Acts, which is the story of the early church, and he wrote the Gospel of Luke. Well, we can date the Gospel of Luke. How? Because we can date Acts. And how do we date Acts? Because there were certain things that took place in the 60s AD. Jesus was put to death in 30 or 32 AD. In the
Mhm.
60s AD, we have certain events that took place in that culture that would have been reported in the book of Acts had they occurred before the book of Acts was written. They were too big. The death of Peter, for instance, the Jewish Roman War in 66 AD, the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Those things certainly would have been written about in Acts had they occurred before Acts was written. So we can date Acts to about 60, 61 AD. Well, he wrote the Gospel of Luke earlier than that. So we can date Luke in the 50s AD. And then a couple of his sources he drew upon, Mark was one of them. So Mark was written even earlier. And here's what's fascinating. We have preserved for us in the New Testament of the Bible creeds and statements of the early church that come even before the Gospels. So, for instance, I think we can date the Gospel of Mark to within 10 years of the death of
Wow.
Jesus. Yeah. And consequently, you know, uh, early historians said it takes at least two generations of time for legend to grow up and wipe out a solid core of historical truth. So this is within the life of eyewitnesses. But we could go back earlier because get this, we have an account of the resurrection of Jesus, including named eyewitnesses and groups of eyewitnesses, that has been dated back by scholars to within months of his death.
Oh,
Within
wow.
months. That is historical gold. That's far too quick to write it off as a legend that took generations of time to develop. So I think we can safely say that all of the Gospels, and I believe this includes John, were earlier than people suppose. I think John may have been written as late as the 90s, but I think it was probably before 70 AD, in my opinion.
Wow.
But certainly Matthew, Mark, and Luke, I think you can clearly date in the 40s and 50s AD. Um, and that's far too early to write it off as legend because it took at least two generations of time for legend to develop and wipe out a solid core of historical truth. So we have
Well,
good dating of the Gospels. They're rooted in eyewitness accounts. They're supported by archaeology in many cases. Even when archaeologists originally doubted Luke on a lot of points,
yeah.
later discoveries prove that Luke was right after all. So I think we can trust what the Gospels tell us about Jesus.
Well, and there's some significance too, isn't there? Because they were written with this generational knowledge. There wasn't
Yes,
time to embellish. There wasn't time, and
that's
they would have
right.
been held accountable.
That's right. That's right. They're being circulated during the lifetimes of Jesus' contemporaries, who would have been all
Mm.
too happy to point out the errors if they were making this stuff up.
Yeah,
So yeah, we have very, very close to the events themselves. In fact, with that report of the resurrection going back within months, I mean that is historical gold. I mean, when you
yeah,
consider get this, the first two biographies of Alexander the Great by Plutarch and Arian were written 300 or 400 years after I think 400 years after his
right,
life, and they're generally considered pretty reliable. Well,
yeah,
we don't have 400 years here. We got a
yeah,
first generation of people who are writing
yeah.
based on
It's pretty.
eyewitness accounts. So good
It's
stuff.
amazing. I want to talk to at length about what you called the linchpin
Yeah.
um, in the entire story, and that is the crucifixion, but the resurrection
Yes. The
of
resurrection for
Christ.
sure. Yeah.
Because a lot of people, the naysayers, and even some scholars still today try to point out that as a big flaw
Yeah.
in the Christianity faith.
It's actually the strongest historical data that we have. I look at 4 points on that. Number 1, was Jesus truly dead after being crucified? Yeah, not only do we have multiple sources in the documents of the New Testament, we've got 5 ancient sources outside the Bible confirming his
Yeah.
execution. No less of a source than the Journal of the American Medical Association, which is a secular scientific peer-reviewed
Yes.
journal carrying an investigation into the death of Jesus. And their conclusion was clearly the weight of the historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead even before the wound to his side was inflicted. But there is no record anywhere of anyone ever surviving a full Roman crucifixion. So Jesus was clearly dead. Second point, we have early accounts of his resurrection. In other words, when I talk about this report that dates back within months of his death, that's far too early to write it off as a legend.
Mhm.
Third, we have an empty tomb. And the strongest point about that is even the enemies of Jesus admitted the tomb was empty. Because when we know from sources inside and from outside the New Testament that when the disciples began proclaiming that Jesus was risen, what the enemies said was, "Oh, well, the disciples stole the body." Well, they're admitting the tomb is empty. They're trying to explain how it got empty. Well, the disciples didn't have the motive, the means, or the opportunity to steal the body. Nobody believed that then. Nobody believes it now. So we have an empty tomb. And then fourth, and this is convincing to me, most of the things we accept about the ancient world as being true, things about the life of Alexander the Great or whatever that we accept as fact, if
Mhm.
you dig into it, what you find is that it's based often, most of the time, almost always on one source or maybe two sources of information. But for the conviction of the disciples that they encountered the resurrected Jesus, we have no fewer than 9 ancient sources inside and outside the New Testament, confirming and corroborating the conviction of the disciples that they encountered the risen Jesus. That is an avalanche of historical data. And that's what
Yeah.
brought me to the conclusion that Jesus didn't just claim to be the Son of God, he backed it up by returning from the dead.
Well, there's a lot to the whole story. I always find it fascinating that it was women. Jesus
Yes,
treated women differently than
he did.
anyone ever before,
Absolutely.
in that time, and the fact that women, uh,
That's That's
into the
one of the
tomb.
ways we know this is an authentic account is because the report says in the Gospels that women discover the tomb empty. Well, in
Yeah,
first century Jewish and Roman culture, women were generally not even allowed to testify in a court of law. They were
no,
not considered to be reliable purveyors of testimony. And so, if here's the point, it's called the criterion of embarrassment that historians use. So, in other words, if you're reading an ancient record and it has information that's embarrassing to the person who's trying to make a case, then it's probably true. Because why would you put it in there if it's going to hurt your
right.
case and be embarrassing?
You
Well,
wouldn't.
for the gospel writers, it was embarrassing that women discovered the tomb empty because it hurt their case among their very audience they were trying to convince in the first century. But they said it anyway. Why would they do that? Because that's apparently what happened, and they were committed to reporting the events as they occurred and letting people draw their own conclusion. So that you bring up a good point. The fact that women are reported to have discovered the tomb empty adds to the authenticity historians will tell you of the
Yeah.
gospel reports themselves.
Yeah, women were nothing back then. I mean, they
Yeah,
served a purpose in some ways, but it was
except in
not.
the eyes of Jesus,
Exactly,
he elevated their status. Absolutely.
exactly. Did you I was a big fan of The Chosen,
Yeah.
and there's a beautiful scene there, and in one of the very first episodes where he meets Mary Magdalene,
Mm,
I believe, and
mm.
she's drunk
Yeah,
in a bar, and
yeah,
no one would give her a second look, right? And I'm sure
yeah,
this is just how Jesus was. The look in his eyes and the way he approached her was so beautiful.
yeah, yeah. It is. I confess I've never seen The Chosen, not
Oh
because I
my
don't
goodness.
want to. I'm kinda waiting till the whole thing's done, and I'm gonna binge watch the whole
Yeah,
thing.
yeah.
But I'm friends with a lot of the people involved with that production. It's an excellent production,
Oh,
and it
it's
does capture that, doesn't it? I mean, that
yes.
the emotional you can read about it on the pages of the Bible, which is kinda like in black and white, but when you see it
Mhm.
lived out in film and video, it brings the color to it.
Yeah,
And,
it does.
Jesus' compassion for people who everybody else had ignored was just so powerful. And that's what he
Yeah,
tells us to do, to reach out to the least among us and serve them and love them with his love.
yeah, absolutely. I wanna take you back, and I know you've probably shared this story a zillion times, but when you spent a long time researching,
Yeah,
um, the case for Christ, even before
right.
it was a book idea.
Yes.
Um, what was that moment like? Because everyone has a moment in their mind. I know one of
Yeah,
the scholars you interviewed said that for him, it was the preponderance of evidence. It was a very
yeah.
logical thing.
Right,
Um,
right. Yeah.
what was it like for you? Do you remember that
Well,
moment?
oh, absolutely. 2 o'clock in the afternoon, November the 8th of 1981. I could close my eyes and
Oh,
relive it today, all these years later. Um, a lot of people say they have a rush of emotion when they come to faith in Jesus. I confess I didn't. I had the rush of reason. The conclusion, this is true. And if
yeah,
this is true, oh my goodness, I am a sinner before a holy God. I am in trouble. I am headed for an eternity that I don't want to go to. This is bad news. I mean, I gripped my heart at that moment. And I realized that, my wife had pointed out a verse to me earlier, John 1:12, that says, but as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, even to those who believe in his name. So I looked at that verse analytically and said, oh, that forms an equation of what it means to become a child of God. Believe plus
mhm.
receive
That's
equals
the
become.
key, isn't it?
It is. So I believed based on the data that Jesus is
Yeah,
who he claimed to be. He proved it by returning from the dead. But that's not enough. I had to because even the demons, the Bible says, believe that
right.
and they shudder at the implications. I had to receive. Receive what? Receive this free gift of forgiveness and eternal life that Jesus purchased for me on the cross when he died as my substitute to pay for all of my sin. And when I
Yeah,
would receive that free gift of his grace in a prayer of repentance and faith, then I would become a child of God. So I got on my knees and I poured out a confession of a lifetime of immorality that would absolutely curl your hair. And at that moment, I received. complete and total forgiveness through Jesus Christ, and I became a child of God. And
How did you
over
tell?
time, my values, my character, my morality, my attitudes, my parenting, my marriage. I mean, after I was baptized, as I became part of a vibrant church, and I learned to read the Bible with fresh eyes and learned how to pray. And I mean, God transformed my life so much so. I mentioned my little daughter earlier. She was 5 years old when I came to faith, and she began to watch the difference God was making in my life. You know, 2 Corinthians
Really?
5:17 says, when we receive that free gift of God's grace, the old has gone, the new has come. And she, from a little 5-year-old perspective, was watching and watching. Something's changing with dad. Something's different with dad. Something's new with dad. And it took about 4 or 5 months. And then one Sunday, she came up to my wife, Leslie, and she said, Mommy, I want God to do for me what he's done for daddy. And
Whoa.
that was the day that she received this free gift of forgiveness and eternal
Mm.
life. Today, she's almost 50 years old, and she's a novelist. She writes books of fiction, but they all have the gospel woven into them. She's married
Oh,
to a guy with a master's degree in apologetics or defending the faith. She's the mother of my two oldest grandchildren. And today we're the best of friends. So God healed that relationship. And my son, same thing. He came to faith at a young age, but he took an academic route, ended up getting a PhD in theology. Today he's a professor at one of the largest Christian seminaries in America, teaching future pastors about Jesus Christ.
oh, wow.
So God changed not just my life, but our children and now our grandchildren.
That's a beautiful story. But I can imagine your wife. Oh my gosh, talk about answered prayer, because I would
Yeah,
imagine she was praying for you when you didn't know she was praying for you.
she was. And the verse she focused on was from the Old Testament, Ezekiel 36:26. That says, moreover, I will give you a new heart, and I will put a new spirit within you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. And the whole 2 years that I'm on that investigative journey, what I didn't know at the time is my wife, every day on her knees in private,
Yeah.
was praying that verse for me. And God
Oh,
ended up answering that prayer on November the 8th of 1981.
it's a beautiful, beautiful story. I wanted to ask you too, because I went back and looked. You have so many good books, and
Oh,
The
thanks.
Case for Christ, I would call that the linchpin
Yeah.
of the series, if you will, but they're all fascinating. Even Seeing the Supernatural, I
Yeah.
think that was in the spring you did. Wonderful. Um, you wrote a book, a novel, which I
Yes.
found this fascinating.
Really? You're the only one.
Yeah, you wrote.
It
I just think the premise is so interesting. So you had
Yeah.
been a Christian, I don't
Yeah.
know, 11, 12 years or so,
Yeah.
and it's called The Ambition.
Yes.
Um, the two characters, a megachurch preacher and a lawyer,
Right.
and the things they wrestle with: moral compromise, looking for
Yes.
success, faith in the face of corruption or temptation, the
Yeah.
dangers of pride.
Yeah.
Was that in any way reflective of your own journey? All Christians have a journey, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
You know, it's funny, my daughter is a novelist, and she's had 5 or 6 published novels, and she said, "Dad, you've written all these books, you should write a novel." And I said, "Oh, honey, I don't think so, I don't." And she said, "No, no, no, do it, try it." So I thought, "I'm gonna write a novel like John Grisham, a legal thriller," you know?
yeah.
So that became the book, The Ambition, which nobody bought. I mean,
It
you
sounds
may
like
be
a fascinating.
one of only a handful of people who ever mentioned the book to me. Nobody ever
Oh,
read
how
this
funny.
book, but it was out of my imagination. Um, it's funny in the book, I twist the story because there was a pastor who had political ambitions, and a miracle happened in his church. And a reporter comes to question him about it, and the pastor's embarrassed by it because he thinks that's going to make people think I'm weird or part of this whacked out church. So here you have the pastor kind of poo-pooing the whole miracle, and the reporter, who was a skeptic, saying, "Well, no, look at this evidence." And so I kind of twisted things back. So it's not based on reality, but it was a lot of fun to write. I will say that, and I'll never write another novel
Oh,
again.
no?
I don't think my publisher wants me to.
That clinched that. Well, I
Yeah,
wanted
that
to
was
ask
it.
you a couple of questions in closing, because, The Case for Christ was written, what, 25 years ago?
Almost 30,
Well,
yeah, 28
almost
years ago.
30,
Yeah,
almost 30. I would imagine over the years, millions have read this book. I mean,
yeah.
huge bestseller. Uh, what kind of feedback have you
Oh,
gotten from
man.
folks? I would
I've had
imagine
such
quite a
great
bit.
one of the biggest mistakes I ever made was when the book was published, somebody at the publisher said to me, "Lee, you should keep a journal of the stories that you're
Mhm.
gonna hear about people coming to faith through the book." And I never did it, and I wish I had because the
Yeah.
stories are just absolutely incredible. I mean, Evel Knievel, the great motorcycle daredevil writer, became a Christian through the book.
Really?
Oh, he had a radical conversion. He was sold out for Christ. Oh, it was unbelievable.
Wow.
Um, Became a good friend of mine. I had a guy right after the book was written. There was an atheist who was an amateur astronomer, and he went to Barnes and Nobles to get the latest astronomy magazine. So he comes in, he picks up the magazine. There's a bench, so he's going to sit down and look through it. And he sits down and he sits on something. He pulls it out, and it's the Case for Christ. And he flips through it and says, "Well, I don't believe this stuff. I'm an atheist." And he threw it down. And he said, "It was like a voice inside of me that said, 'You need to read that book.'" So he said, "I picked up the book, I bought it, I read it, I came to faith." And he wrote this note to me. This is about in the year 2000 to thank me for writing the book and tell me the story. So I actually got to know him and I invited him to speak to the publisher. They had a meeting of all the staff of Zondervan Publishing House. And I said, "Tell your story because it's a great story about how God can use a book to reach someone with the gospel." And so he did. And then just a couple of years ago, I got a letter from him, and he's now retired and he lives in Kentucky and he's an elder of his Baptist church there. So he's still following the
Wow.
Lord. So all kinds of stories like that. It's been just so amazing how God has used that book well beyond anything I ever put into it.
Yeah, well, I will tell you, I have a dear friend whose husband is a brilliant doctor,
Mm.
an atheist, and so I've sent him your book.
Oh, good.
But I did not get a response, I don't
Yeah.
expect to, but, I just think it's so well done, and
Well,
even for kids.
sometimes it'll sit on a shelf for years. I'll tell you a quick
Yeah.
story. There was a guy whose brother came to, or no, he himself came to faith, this guy, at one of the first Billy Graham rallies. So in the 1950s. And so he wanted to reach his brother. His brother was a very prominent attorney, patent attorney in Los Angeles. So he approached his brother to tell him the gospel. His brother, not interested, shut him down. "Don't tell me about that stuff." And so this guy said, "I prayed for my brother for 48 years and 348 days." He kept track.
Wow.
And along the way, he gave him a copy after the book came out, The Case for Christ. His brother refused to read it. He put it on his shelf. Well, after 48 years of this guy reaching out to his brother contracted pancreatic cancer. And as he was declining in his health, he picked up The Case for Christ from his bookshelf and read it and came to faith before he died. So,
Oh,
sometimes you give someone a book and you pray for them and they don't
yeah.
read it. It sits on a shelf. But here's a guy, it sat on the shelf for who knows how long before he finally looked at it and read it. So I'd say don't give up on people. Give them a resource. And if they don't read it right away, don't take that as a bad sign. It may just take some time.
Sometimes it's planting the seeds, right?
It
That
is. That's right. Yeah.
it really is. Well, I loved your original, The Case for I've
Oh,
loved
thanks.
so many of your books. It's absolutely fabulous, but the new one now is so wonderful because it's a perfect gift to send someone because you take the same and I'll get your publicist to send me the right
Yes, the new one.
graphic.
Yes.
Um, it just condenses the book, the
Yeah.
original Case for Christ, into the nuggets, really. Um,
Well, the new book actually, which is supplanted or replaced that, is same title, Case for Christmas. It's a complete rewrite. It's like 90% new. And there've been
oh,
a lot of new
wow.
discoveries in recent years that relate to the birth of Jesus and so forth. So it's completely updated. And there's even a Bible study if you want to do a independent or get a group
Yeah,
together and do a Bible study. We have a study guide. In fact, I got a call last night from a friend of mine in California, and I'm in my robe, getting ready to go to bed. And on California time, his small group was meeting, and they're going through the small group study of the Case for Christmas. And he said, "Could you talk to him?" I said, "I'll do it on the phone, but I'm in my pajamas, I'm not gonna." So I encourage them through the phone, but, so there's a
So
Bible
it's
study
all
that comes
new.
with it.
Okay, well, I that brings another quick question to you.
Yeah.
What in your mind, what's the biggest new nugget of information, that bolsters, the case for
Well,
Christ?
why do we celebrate Christmas on December the 25th? Nobody's been sure through the centuries. Some theologians in the early days thought Jesus was born on May 20th.
Yeah.
Well, they've had some new discoveries. The discovery is that in the early Christian church, there was a strong connection between redemption, creation, and redemption. And so they believed, it sounds a little irrational, but they believed back then that Jesus would have been conceived on the same day of the year that he ultimately died because of this connection between creation and redemption.
Mhm.
And so in the year 200, a guy named Tertullian, who was an early Christian leader, said, "Oh, I want to calculate what was the date that Jesus died." And he calculated on the Roman calendar of the day, he died on March the 25th. And so the Christians began, okay, well, then Jesus would have been conceived on March the 25th. Well, if he was conceived on March the 25th, just fast forward 9 months of gestation, he would have been born December the 25th. And sure enough, I found an ancient reference by an historian about the year 200 named Sextus Julius Africanus, who said Jesus was conceived on March the 25th. And I'm thinking, how does he know? No, nobody knows the date. Oh, I get
Yeah.
it now. It's because they calculated that was when he died. Therefore, that must be the date that he was conceived. And that's where they came up with December the 25th, because the earliest Christians didn't observe birthdays. It was not a thing with early Christians. They used to make fun of the Romans for observing birthdays.
Oh,
And then
really? I didn't know
later,
that.
they started to say, well, yeah, when was Jesus born? We should celebrate that. And that's what happened.
So you think December 25th is the right.
I think, that's what we celebrate. It could
Yeah,
very well be the
it's
day, but we don't know. Some
no.
theologians in the early days said March 20th. So I like to kind of observe both of them.
Yeah, I agree, and there's something with Christianity, it's in your heart, it's not in a
Yeah,
book. You know
that's
what?
right.
Well, it's in the
It doesn't
Bible,
really
I guess to
matter
get
the
you there.
day.
No, no,
That's right.
but your books are wonderful,
Well,
and,
thanks so much.
The Case for Christmas would make a beautiful, beautiful Christmas gift to believers and non-believers alike.
Well, we kept it really inexpensive. You can get it
Yeah,
online as cheap as 250.
yeah,
So
it's great.
yeah, it'd be an easy book to give away. And I literally I had to buy them myself. I bought 300 copies of it, and my goal is to give them away to people between now
Yeah,
and Christmas. So
that's a great
yesterday I
idea.
had my annual physical and my dental checkup. And, so I gave them to all the people in the office, to the doctor, to the dentist,
Oh,
to the receptionist, and so I give them away to flight attendants and to servers at restaurants and to hotel clerks, and I just wanna spread them far and wide because the gospel is in the book, and, it's my hope that God will use it this Christmas season.
yeah, I wonder if you ever marvel at how much God has used your book over the
It's
years.
it's been an adventure. It's been a great
Yeah,
adventure.
a beautiful one, I would imagine.
Yeah,
Well,
really
Lee,
so.
I wanna wish you and your family, your wife, who's been in my prayers, um,
Thanks. She's here
a very
somewhere,
Merry
so
Christmas. Well, wishing you all a very Merry Christmas. I hope you'll come back
thank you.
sometime, and then we'll talk
Yeah.
about the book, the new stuff
Yes. Yes.
that I will get because 'cause we'd love to have you back.
I'd love
This
to
was a
do
big
that.
deal for me. You're one of those
Wow,
authors out there that was like, "Oh my gosh,
that's so
it's
encouraging.
a
That
blessing."
that that makes my day.
I'm so glad to hear that. Have a beautiful one, sir.
You too. God bless you and
Okay,
all your viewers.
God
Bye-bye.
bless.
Get social with us. Follow us on Instagram at Goodtaste TV.